my speech, it concerns both metaphysical foundations of black metal, changes in the real world, as seen maybe from the pagan perspective, and a kind of synthesis between them. The title of my speech is Wotan, Pan, Dionysus, at the gates of the grand European solstice. On the one hand, we were talking about the modern civilization, modern world, in the perspective of the previous speech. It's first of all industrial or even post-industrial world, post-modern world. And as Sviatoslav in his speech mentioned, it is associated in terms of mythological European worldview with the Titanic aspect. For a person of Christian worldview, it's of course demonic forces, infernal forces, but today's event is dedicated to the event of winter solstice. And first of all, our phraseology should be connected with the traditional European mythological worldview. So it's quite natural that I will also refer to this Titanic aspect when I will be talking about modern civilization and some of its manifestations. At the same time, we know that Wotan, Pan, Dionysus are the names of the gods. So does it mean that I oppose this Titanic pole, the one which is also quite brightly manifested in black metal? We know the electro guitars. It's also all this craftsmanship, all this revolt, which is perceived in this kind of music. We associate it with the Titanic pole. So does it mean that we have to forget about guitars, for instance, like Varg Vikernes did, switch to some skaldic metal, or even not metal, but simply music, and so to speak, choose the side of the gods in their fight with the titans, so-called titanomachia? Actually, my answer would be no. I'm still searching for the synthesis between these two worlds, for the third way. And also in terms of the solution to the natural problems, I also believe that we can refer to technological means, titanic forces, in order to solve these problems. And this synthesis, as for me, is embodied in these three aforementioned figures, these three deities, Wotan, Pan, and Dionysus. Why them, I will explain a little bit later. Overall, there are gods, door keepers, border keepers, and there are gods who can be described as gate openers. And these deities, Wotan, Pan, Dionysus, are first of all gate openers, but it is not their only function, unless by opening the gates we mean the great changes of the meta-historical cycles. In Ukrainian or in Russian, winter solstice is not only сонцестояння or солнцестояние, it's сонцеворот. It's like the idea, vorot, it's spinning, turning around. This idea of this kolovrat, maybe you know this symbol, which resembles swastika, so it also has this idea of motion, of changing, of the meta-historical cycles. And that's why it's a dynamic notion, which is not preserved in this English version. But by opening the gates to something else, I mean, first of all, above all, this change of the cycles. And as for me, it is heralded by these figures, which we can understand not in a narrow religious sense, as for instance some neo-pagan communities could understand, but first of all in a metaphysical sense, or at least in a sense of archetypes of Carl Gustav Jung, which correspond with our energies, some aspects of human subjectivity, which is always directly, resonates with the metaphysical world, as it was also mentioned by Sviatoslav. But of course, it is directly connected with living external world, which was disclosed in the previous speech. There is no contradiction. As I also said in the introduction to the conference, this darkest, longest European night, first of all, or night simply, it symbolizes the current state of European and actually world historical entropy and decline. But at the same time, when we speak about night, we know that it's something referring to the astronomical cycles, natural cycles. And this cyclic worldview, I agree, indeed, it always gives hope for the rebirth. It is always connected with mythological worldview, which gives this promise of rebirth, which is its essential part. This rebirth is connected with these figures in the following respect. But first of all, we have to figure out what unites these quite different deities, Germanic Wotan and Greek or Roman Dionysus and Pan. The answer is simple. This is the elemental, this is the ecstatic, and this is the wild, which is symbolized by the archetypes of these deities. If we try to find the common denominator, it is, first of all, the ability to break through the established orders, be them external or internal. It is some dynamic and overwhelming force which changes, alters radically the status quo. So in the 21st century, these deities, although they of course were discussed much earlier, they re-emerged in the so-called Third Way discourse, which is directly dedicated to the search of the ways out of the Iron Age, Kali Yuga. First of all, it was born in the interwar Germany, but it is not limited by these geographic boundaries. It's connected with names like Ernst Junger, Martin Heidegger, Julius Evola, if we speak about Italy, Britain Oswald Mosley, French Pierre de La Rochelle. But first of all, of course, it was, as I said, interwar Germany. Carl Schmitt, later Armin Moller, a Swiss German historian who described this phenomenon he called Third Way conservative revolution in his major work. So it was not a only political movement, although one of its consequences was quite literal political victory of National Socialism as one of its branches, because in the movement, in the branches of this movement was also, among the branches of this general conservative revolutionary movement, was also the Völkische movement, which is believed to be the basis for National Socialism. Other movements were young conservatives, which were like new conservatives, I would say. So they have something in common with traditionalists, counter-revolutionaries, but at the same time they have something in common with new nationalists. National revolutionaries, like Junger, who were like the most radical in this respect, who wanted to create new society and resemble most radical aspirations of the general black metal community. I also have one article in which I compare metapolitical trends within this general Third Way movement and branches within the black metal genre. We also have folk metal, which corresponds with Völkische and their basic worldview intuitions, nature, community, healthy lifestyle, which was described in the previous speech. We have some bands which also glorify the past, which have this maybe, yes, indeed, grandiose metaphors like empire and something which is quite in common with the worldview of young conservatives. We have bands which to a great extent correspond with metaphysical intuitions of national revolutionaries. It's like radical opposition, counter system. It's like this gnostic denial of reality, but not for the sake of this dualistic denial, which is a sign of desert religions, but as something which also promises a fruitful change. For instance, when Hendrik Möbius described the essence of black metal, he believed that it combines both archetypes of the European past roots and at the same time this Luciferian will to power and might. So for us, for Europeans, of course, Lucifer is something which is connected with the archetype of gnosis, but it's not the gnosis of desert religions. It is something very natural and native for us. It's like this Faustian archetype, which can be found as well in Greek mythology in the form of Prometheus. Julius Evola also wrote about it. But returning to the topic of my speech, to some extent there is opposition between this Titanic world, which is the face of the modern civilization, and at the same time with the world of the gods, which in terms of Ernst Junger corresponds with the world of culture, higher values, meaning, memory about the past, and everything which is so dear for our souls, I would say. And Prometheus is a Titan. So does it mean that, first of all, it represents modern civilization? Again, my answer is no. Again, we have to search for this synthesis, and this Luciferian archetype of Prometheus, it stands somewhere in between. And in the context of previous speeches, we indeed have to head these destructive forces of contemporaneity, maybe quite probably under the banner of this Luciferian archetype, which in fact has a lot in common with an archetype of Wotan. If we talk about the reintroduction of these names in the modern third way discourse, which is again, I understand, much wider than interwar movement. Now we also have New Right, many different movements which sprout from this original conservative revolutionary current. We have a lot of influences in music, in art, so of course now it's much, much bigger and wider. So if I talk about it, I can mention 7-8 figures who are responsible for reintroduction of these deities in this philosophical cultural discourse. For Wotan, it's above all Carl Gustav Jung, of course, his famous essay, Wotan, in which he also was the first one who paralleled Wotan with Greek Dionysus, and I will let you explain why. For Pan, it's in a literature world, of course, Knud Hamsun, also brother of Ernst Junger, Friedrich Georg Junger, and of course, to a great extent, Aleister Crowley, although he is not a representative of the third way, but influences of his poetry, his views, we can also trace in this modern field, modern third way field. And first of all, I mean his poetry like Hymn to Lucifer or Hymn to Pan, as well as the Book of the Law, which may be considered as a part of world cultural legacy. Of course, when I mention him, I never mean some hedonistic, individualistic, materialistic interpretation of thelema. It's now not interesting in the context of this subject. But I mean, first of all, the aforementioned poetries in which he also described it quite well, this archetype of Pan and Lucifer. And for Dionysus is, first of all, Friedrich Hölderlin, German poet, who in general introduced this idea of God, this idea of the flight of the gods who left this world, a world which is reigned by the iron ones. These are titans, of course. And now we and poets who feel this change in a metaphysical structure of reality, first of all, they are anticipating the return of the gods. It's also a metaphor which is widely used in texts of philosophers like Martin Heidegger, for instance, who was a big admirer of Hölderlin. Now we summon the gods back. And this is the idea which is connected also with Dionysus, a god of sacred wine, a god of ecstasy, the god which talks about surpassing of limits of the boundaries in our context of the boundaries of the modern civilization and its fixed understanding of man, its purpose in the world, its values, goals in life, and so on and so forth. So it's Hölderlin, then of course Friedrich Nietzsche. Many of you, I think, read his Birth of Tragedy from the sense of music, from the spirit of music. He introduced its distinction between the Dionysian and Apollonian. Nietzsche actually, he was a philologist, but he made a revolution in the cultural studies of antiquity, because before antiquity was perceived as a kind of solar world, something very orderly, beautiful, all this rhythmic structure of the metaphysical reality which are directly mirrored in the external world, architecture, life, everything. And Nietzsche, he saw this depth abyss behind these solar forms, and he found it in a choir of satyrs, in a Greek tragedy, first of all, and he blamed Socrates for this rationalistic revolution in the life of antiquity, which actually has led to the modern civilization as we perceive it today. So for Nietzsche, the root of decline was not even Christianity. He also blamed it for many so to speak, destructive aspects of the modern world. But for him it began, of course, much earlier, and he connected with the tradition of rationalism in philosophy. And philosophy of antiquity, as we know, it was not only one of the spheres of human spirit, one of the departments in the universities, it was actually the birth of European culture. Everything started with Plato, Aristotle, and later it differentiated in different branches of sciences. Even the understanding of art, everything was defined basically by philosophers. So, of course, it's important for understanding what's going on here and now. And third person for Dionysus is Ernst Junger. theorist of the third way, the face of conservative revolution, as believed by Armin Moller, his secretary and the author of this work, major work about this current. He was disciple of Nietzsche, so of course he mediated quite a lot about the sense of this God, whom he basically considered something in between of the gods and titans. That's why he's also the most promising author in terms of the search for this synthesis between the modern civilization and the remedy for it, which is also, as for me, embodied in the very phenomenon of black metal. On the one hand, it's unimaginable without the modern world, industrial civilization, electro guitars, everything. It's just the brightest example. And between these higher values which we anticipate, proclaim in songs, and try to achieve in real life. Also, Ernst Jünger believed that, metaphorically speaking, in terms of philosophy of culture, man, it has always been somewhere in between of these two reigns, reign of titans and reign of the gods, and he has to remain friends with both. So it's not a matter of finding a shelter from this titanic world in some in reality which is completely deprived of the manifestations of modern civilization, somewhere in the forest. It can be forest, but it can be, first of all, metaphorical forest. It's also one of the titles of Jünger's major works. So it's the matter of finding the balance under, as for me, under this Luciferian archetype, which connects us, our European past, with some tendencies of the modern civilization, which are reflected in this Faustian dynamic spirit, thirst for conquer and power. We can't deny that on the one hand it's the root of all problems, on the other hand it's indeed the features of the European man as such. And if we refuse from it, maybe we will cut a part of our nature. Wotan, as understood by Carl Gustav Jung, basically he understood him as indeed gate opener, Führer Teutonicus, as something that empowers from inside and alters the person. When we say about spiritual revolutions, it's not only the matter of rationalistic understanding, some knowledge, which was mentioned by Svetoslav. Of course, it's very important, and we need to have this global vision. But any changes, they begin from, I would say, altered state of consciousness, which can never be programmed and planned. They can be anticipated, maybe we can make some practices, but anyway, it's always the break of continuity of our daily lives. It's something in common with, I don't know, some divine encounter, hierophany, manifestation of the sacred, some kind of transgression. Otherwise, it's not real, it's artificial. So Wotan is something which, in opinion of Jung, heralds this change. He wrote this essay in order to explain the advent of National Socialism in Germany. In his opinion, it was the manifestation of archetype of Wotan, which of course was a challenge to the Christian world, to the modern world, as this secularized Christian perspective of history, humanity, and goals in life. So for him it was the awakening of roots of irrational, but first of all it was a kind of wind which, as Wotan said, scatters nations before it like dry leaves. And what is very interesting, this is the same kind of power which, for instance, inspires berserks who go to fight, makes them mad, insane. This is this military strength from inside, and at the same time this kind of power inspires poets to create. So it's also the essence of poetic inspiration, the same kind of power, the quality of being possessed by something. That's why Jung actually found the closest analog of Wotan not in Greek Zeus, supreme god of Greek pantheon, not in Ares or Roman Mars, god of war, not even in Hermes or Mercury, because we know that Wotan was also a cunning god. He was a god of trade and sailors. So in some respects, as an archaic deity, he combines manifestations of other deities, including Hermes. but no, it was not him. For him it was Dionysus, namely because Dionysus, as a god of sacred wine, as a god of ecstasy, also has this feeling of transcending one's limitations, of this force which changes from inside, occupies from inside, and has this revolutionary power which we also search in the political world and external world. Dionysus was also a god of sacred processions, orgiastic rites, and processions in which actually the world of the living is united with the world of the dead. So all distinctions are blurred. On the other hand, is also one of the brightest features of the modern world, Titanic world, which despises all the differences, which turns all the world into this working landscape of production. It's like Titan Prometheus, but not in his aspect of Gnostic Titan who brought fire to humans from Olympus. Modern world is Titanic and has a feature of Prometheus, first of all, in the aspect of Homo faber, man who works, who produces, who again creates a world in the one grandiose factory. So in this respect, it's not that kind of Luciferian, Promethean archetype which heralds some changes. It is something that rather should be overcome. And here I agree with that we need to cut production and have to perceive world differently. If we try to perceive world differently, if we try to find something which follows this wind, and Jung also mentioned Nietzsche Zarathustra, of course, who also wrote about the unknown God, the God who also manifests itself as a kind of wind, a storm, which radically changes its disciples. And Zarathustra was compared by his disciples himself to this kind of storm. This wind is followed by the different world perspective. And world perspective, which was described in the previous speech, it is connected with the denial of the instrumental rationality. Awakening of the archetype of Wotan, of course, it was a big challenge to the rational world. And of course, it's very easy to stay on the side of the left and say that the right, they deny reason, they only proclaim some bloody roots, some irrational factors, and it's no remedy for the problems, it's just a matter of escapism. But in reality, what is spoken of here, it's not the denial of rationality, but transcendence. It's, as I said, this power which changes the status quo, which makes this revolutionary change in a society and maybe in a meta-historical eons. So it's completely different. And at a lower level, it manifests itself as a denial of, first of all, instrumental rationality, but not rationality in general. And here, of course, the main figure is Pan, who on the one hand is a god of fertility, of sexual nature, but at the same time is this world spirit which heralds, which symbolizes the unity of world forces and as well as unity of microcosm and microcosm. When I mentioned Crowley and his hymns to Lucifer and to Pan, he to some extent compared these two figures. And it's quite interesting that Julius Evola, who is known for his contempt to all occult societies and of course Church of Satan and things like that, he would fairly describe as something hedonistic and materialistic, which by the way we also find in some branches of black metal community. They represent the same understanding of Satanism. So Julius Evola, who of course despised these ideas, his account of Crowley and Crowleyanism was surprisingly positive. He believed, at first was impressed by the fact that Crowley was not only a magician, poet, painter, but also a mountaineer who attempted to conquer some higher peaks of Himalayas. Also, he believed that actually Crowley promotes this left-hand path as a way of gaining transcendental knowledge or states, and he believed that he surpasses mere pseudo-pagan naturalism because when he says that every man and every woman is a star, he doesn't mean that everyone is equal, doesn't promote egalitarianism, but in fact he says that there is hidden transcendental principle inside every one of us, and we have to awaken it. And for him, the purpose in Evola's eyes, the purpose of these orgiastic rites, and the central figure of these rites was great god Pan. Their goal was to transform oneself, and the one who dares to practice them has to transform doses of poison too large into food. And doses of poison, of course, it was literally it was drugs, but not only them. It was just dangerous encounters and experience practiced by those who dare to enter this path. So it was quite interesting account of Pan, because it was connected with Luciferian archetype, but in a non-Christian way, because Christians, of course, first of all compare this aspect of the horned god, ancient past, and devil. You know, we will not dwell on it, but here it was Luciferian archetype as the spirit of nobility, the spirit actually of hierarchy, if you remember this hymn to Lucifer and or read it for the first time, and actually of Gnosis, of course. But it's quite interesting that Crowley, as a representative of this Anglophone world, he was only actually a popularizer of this archetype of Pan. Before, in the so-called Victorian or Edwardian era, it is believed that British literature had a compensatory fascination with Pan, and it was quite symptomatic, because this figure helped to raise the most essential for the modern man issues, like dualism between Christianity and paganism, between morals and hedonism, between civilization and Arcady, the homeland of Pan. Actually, at the same time, we know that even before this era, an era of Romanticism, or at the same time approximately, Pan was also widely used in European literature, this image, and he symbolized some pastoral, bucolic, poetic existence. It's like god of all shepherds, and maybe European writers and thinkers tried to find a shelter in this image, because they've already anticipated the challenges which will be brought by the First World War and Second World War. And also at the same time, it was widely recognized that this god has this semi-bestial, lustful nature, and black metal as the genre which challenges challenges hypocritical post-Christian morals. It's of course also very sensitive to these aspects of nature, sexuality, and bestiality. It was also felt in a society, but of course Crowley was the one who manifested them to the brightest extent. Anyway, it's not. It doesn't exhaust the archetype of Pan, because returning to the novel by Knut Hamsun, maybe some of you read it. It's called Pan. Pan is hardly ever mentioned there, but it's the main character of the novel. And we see that it symbolizes the powers of nature, but in a non-biological or in supra-biological sense. It also symbolizes the power of love, but it also in its non-biological sense, because if you read this novel, you know that it was not a happy love encounter from a point of view of biological purpose of love. I mean, marriage and family. It was to a great extent a tragic story, but as many stories of Knut Hamsun, it gives this sense of this overwhelming power of nature, when even the tragic end is perceived like a grace, because it's very intense feelings, very intense worldview, something which can be hardly described by words, but which gives the sense of these higher values. Something actually superhuman. And first of all, it was symbolized by beautiful Norwegian landscapes, and by the power which was felt inside by heroes of this novel. But in terms, if we return to which views the entire world as a playground which can be used, destroyed, exhausted, Then the main figure here is Friedrich Georg Junger, brother of Ernst Junger, who, among others, wrote a trilogy, Gods, Titans, Greek Heroes. And he understood God, first of all, this archaic God of the wild, of the forests, which symbolizes this non-instrumental, non-pragmatic action. The one who lives in the unnamed ground, in the forest, the forest which actually has no limits, because when you name this forest, you mean that it is owned by somebody. But Pan, it's like unknown creature, something in the wild, somewhere in the wild, who is playing his flute, who actually does nothing for the purpose. Like, for instance, Prometheus in the aspect of Homo faber, not Gnosis, but Homo faber, somebody who produces, who changes, transforms something. So Pan is the very opposite of this Titanic aspect. He does nothing for a purpose. He plays, we could say enjoys existence, but it would be too hedonistic. So it's something which is closely related to this richness of the wild, which does not know the hand of the modern world, with his instrumental rationality, which puts everything in the service of the shell of modern man. So this is the great god Pan. And maybe you also know about this mythological plot. It is found in a book Moralia of historian Plutarch from antiquity. One sailor in times of Tiberius, he sailed by ship. He was actually a leader there, to Italy. He passed to the island of Palodus. His name was Samos, but it's not important. So he heard a divine voice which said to him, "Are you here? If yes, come to the island of Palodus and proclaim there that the great god Pan is dead." And when this sailor came to this island and proclaimed it, instant lamentation followed in the air. So it is something which is also quite popular in modern third way discourse, in some songs, texts. This idea of the death of great god Pan as the root of the modern state of world decline is developed and explored in a variety of literary and musical pieces of work. Pan, of course, is closely related to Dionysus. Again, they have similar manifestations. They also connected to the wild, to satyrs, to forest creatures. But Dionysus is indeed a key figure here, because, again, I agree with Jung that it has this feeling, this main intrinsic feature of the archetype of Wotan, as this quality of being possessed, something which forces us to transcend the status quo. Also, this is the feeling of elemental, which was praised by Ernst Junger when he said about the liberal individual which lives in under conditions of security. His main purpose is to find comfortable life and to hide himself from danger. And it's not only dangers of industrial world in the 20th century, all these horrors of First, Second World War, cars in the streets, first car accidents. No, not only that. In Junger's opinion, liberal individual tries to hide also from any strong, intense feelings, like that described in the novel of Knud Hamsun. It's a shallow person. So we've spoken a lot about today about comfort, about hedonism, consumerism, but it's like negative manifestation of this human type. But from this perspective, it's first of all indeed an escape from everything higher than can force the human to change the world and change himself, to give the higher meaning to his life, to the life of this person. So in this respect, archetypes of Wotan, Pan, Dionysus, they're indeed the very opposite of this image of the modern world, man, and world, of course, as its production creature. Because this is, first of all, the idea of sheltering from everything intense, real, and higher that can break this small artificial world. Dionysus, and according to Junger, as I said, was something in between of the gods and the titans. Because again, one of the main ideas of my speech is that we should not hide from the dangers of the modern world, because it's not only negativity, pure. I agree with Junger that titans, they also have their place in the cosmic structure. They also have both negative and positive manifestations, just like the archetype of Prometheus is ambiguous. Yesterday we listened to songs by Nar Mataron, Lucifer, Prometheus, so we hear it almost in every black metal song. So of course, if we deny these titanic aspects, we indeed should shift to skaldic music along with Varg. I don't say that it's a bad decision, but if we do not want to do it, we need to find this third way in theory, otherwise it would be a little bit funny. So again, in terms of philosophy of culture, titans, they stand for this destruction of all borders. It's like chthonic creatures which produce, destroy, its endless will to power. It's revolt against gods, basically. And gods, they stand for differentiations, for meaning, for culture, for higher values, for memory of the past. So they are advocates of art and history, whereas titans are patrons of crafts, first of all, technologies. That's why they are connected to the Faustian spirit, Faust, who also used some magical technologies, as we could say. But if we oppose these two worlds, first of all, we deny the very essence of myth, because we cannot artificially take this dark side, like Christians would do, and exclude it as something non-existent and ontological evil, as Christians perceive Satan. It's something non-existent according to their metaphysics. It's something which is deprived of being, whereas God is the fullness of being. So for the mythological heaven world, there is a balance between good and evil, so to speak. There's dark sides of world nature. They also have their purpose. And the modern world, as the world in which, as Junger said, Titan Prometheus has left the depths, so he's freed from his chains, and now he walks across the world across his creation, the planetary state, because all of us will agree that borders between modern world are artificial, and the force which destroyed these borders is, first of all, technology, post-industrial world. Industrial technologies, I mean armament, infrastructure, echoes of the former century, of course it also remains, but also it's audio-video technologies which unite the entire world, create this network across the globe. So it's the kingdom of titans. And now we find ourselves in it, and when we search for higher meaning of purpose, it means that we address to the gods. As Junger said, titans, they do not need prayers. We pray to them by means of work. So as long as we live in our daily routines, make some repetitive actions, work, and work is not only work in opposition to leisure time. Junger also wrote about it. There is no opposition. Even when people go to disco, they dance. When they go to ASGARDSREI festival, they also act in a similar manner, as if they wear the uniform, as if they march on a military parade. So it's the general feature of the modern society, of modern world. We have this trace of titans on our faces, and we cannot get rid of it. So we pray to the titans, of course, in quotation marks, by means of this endless production. We try to achieve some result. We do something for the purpose. We are involved in constant motion and activism. Again, I do not say that it's all bad, not of course. It's just the way that we found ourselves in the modern world. But if we want to make some change, we also have to refer to the world of the gods, of course. And before we do it, we need the gods, door openers, gate openers, the ones who can destroy this world order, old world order. It was mentioned also by Sviatoslav in his speech. We have to exhaust these conditions of the previous century, of the world we live in as well. We have to go to the end, and only then, on the ruins of the world war, old world may appear something new. So again, we find ourselves in between of these two worlds, and we can use opportunities of any of them. And that's why Junger said that Dionysus, he had no fixed place at Olympus, so he is god, of course, but at the same time he has something barbarian, it's something titanic. According to one myth, Dionysus was torn by Titans himself. Then his heart was preserved, and he was recreated. And Zeus, he destroyed the Titans by lightning, and from the remnants of their flesh and earth, he created the man. That's why we have both titanic aspects and godly. That's why we also have this feeling of rebellion, this endless voluntarism, which is peculiar for Titans. And at the same time, of course, we're connected to the world of art, culture, higher meaning and purpose. And of course, we cannot separate these sides of our nature, one from another. That's why Junger, as disciple of Nietzsche, he partially polemicized with him, and he believed that the correct opposition is not between the Apollonic order, Apollo, the god who stands for these solar forms, for this illusion, and the Dionysian principle, which stands for this horrific truth, this abyss hidden beneath the solar and orderly forms. The correct opposition, in Junger's opinion, was between the Titans and the gods. And Dionysus is our biggest friend among the gods now, namely because he occupies this place in between of Olympus and the underworld. He also can go to the below, and he friends of the dead. He's their patron. He's the one who was also celebrated during the Eleusinian mysteries. He's believed to be also the son of Demeter, so he's closely connected with the underworld, chthonic world of the Titans. Junger says, when gods disappear, we instantly feel it. When Zeus departs, the meaning of scepter, crown, rule, it is lost. When Ares, or Mars in Roman, bids farewell, we also see the decline of military honor, of war art as it was known before. Now it's only the matter of being able of using technology. The person could be totally degenerative, but if he can use technology properly, he will be a victor. So Titans, of course, they destroy these borders not only between states by means of technology, they also destroy the borders between hierarchies, the former social estates, castes in terms of Hindi system. So it's not important whether you're a warrior or a peasant, whether you're an aristocrat or a merchant. If you know how to use certain technological aspects of the world, you can achieve your result. So it's a total blur. But so when gods depart, like Aphrodite, for instance, Junger says, also we find ourselves in under conditions of promiscuous interbreeding. And when great god Pan dies, nature is also dying. But again, our friend and patron and mediator in this situation is Dionysus, god of sacred wine. And maybe some of you also heard about the book by Ernst Junger. It's quite controversial book from the point of view of the right. It's called Approaches. It's dedicated to his drug experiments. Yeah, it was translated recently to Polish, right? Yes. Also to English. It's available online. Junger, he was not only a legendary veteran, participant of two world wars. He received 14 wounds in the First World War. He was decorated with the highest military award, Pour le Mérite. So he is legendary veteran, writer, aventurist, adventurer, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, he is known for his drug experiments with all kinds of drugs, but first of all, psychedelics. And he described his experience in these books. In this book, he portrayed it as a means of, again, gaining an altered state of consciousness. And he explained many times that he refuses to be a guru for this beatnik generation, psychedelic generation, which finds some substitutes for the lost religious, try to fill this gap with something else. With some drug experiments or sexual revolution or something else, which of course will never feel it. So he said that I take drugs only under medical supervision. He was a friend of Albert Hofmann, inventor of LSD, and I do it out of curiosity for the transcendental spaces. In his book, he described his own philosophy of wine, different social dangers of drugs, rights connected with it. So it's also interested from the cultural point of view. But for us, again, it's most of all important from the point of view of this ability to transcend. If we talk about changes, we can never change it. We need some forces which could empower us, which could give real change instead of talking about it. So Junger also referred to the power of psychedelics. He described his experiments with mushrooms, with LSD as a chemical analog, and with other substances. And there also he, of course, mentioned his mythological studies. It's his signature feature. He always puts inside of some novels some very important philosophical consideration. For instance, his concept of the anarch, right-wing anarchist. It's also as if written on the margins of the novel. So in this book, he also writes about Dionysus, and he says that modern Eleusinion, the place where was celebrated great and minor Eleusinian mysteries, the mysteries which dedicated to the plot of Persephone's abduction by Hades, daughter of Demeter. So now these temples are actually turned into factories. Factories, these are churches of titans. But it could be a problem for those who celebrate mysteries in the spring, minor mysteries. But those who celebrate major mysteries in the autumn is not a problem, because this factory still can shelter them from the rain in autumn. So this was Junger's symbolical way of saying that this titanic world also gives us opportunities for a shelter. Again, it's not the total negativity, total collapse. We still find here creative forces, just like titans are all endowed with their own place in this cosmic hierarchy, their own function. And speaking about this transcending power of substances, Junger, of course, also mentioned free thinkers, heretics, mystics, pantheists, the one who did not need any drugs to come to some revelations. He said that free thinkers have never been welcomed by church, people like Heraclitus or Nietzsche. In spite of the very big depths which church owned to them, their, again, understandings. So for us, these figures like Wotan, like Dionysus, like Pan, they're important because we don't need the mediation of priests or some other persons who are in charge, so to speak, of some transcendental knowledge. Now, when we live in a postmodern world, when the West has lost almost all of its traditions, I mean also religious traditions, some people like René Guénon choose to go to the East and find there some remnants of the sacred. But others who decide to stay true to European roots, they remain in the void. So under these conditions, it's very important for us to search some spheres in which these archetypes can serve as our teachers. And they teach, Junger says, by means of physical contact, like Aphrodite, or by means of verses and songs like Orpheus. And in this respect, Dionysus, who stands for tragic music, is also manifested in black metal, as for me. For us, it's a substitute of religion to a big extent. We don't need to go to church and listen to some mass, because our mass is much better, and we are connected through it to our own archetypes. And this is the way Junger, in a symbolic sense, tried to draw our attention to quite concrete, definite social spheres in which we can find this knowledge without the mediation of priestly hierarchies or some other institutions which monopolize sacred knowledge. And for him, in one of his novels, he also connected this personal gnosis in the groups, with the changes on the macro level. So persons who undergo the spiritual revolution, they can hasten the external changes. It was interconnectedness of internal and external alchemy. If we practice something, be it some, I don't know, esoteric practices which help to change, which give us altered state of consciousness, if it's art, which is also very revolutionary and overwhelming, patron of which can also be Dionysus. No matter, we can find this sphere, it's not so hard in the modern world. This is, it can be the way out of this Iron Age. The main idea is not to view it in the dualistic Christian view, Christian manner, and to remember that this revolutionary, Luciferian, Promethean, Faustian archetype can be found in the features of the modern civilization, which in this respect is not totally degenerate, and in some respects even offers us unique opportunity for what we could say today, could name today as self-initiation, which again is a key to changes on the grand meta-historical level. So thank you for your attention. I hope the keys are heard.